Hello, I am Moonfasa, and I want to welcome you to a new series where I'll be showing you how to counter certain archetypes that may be troubling you on the ranked ladder or in tournaments. Today we're going to take a look at Rush, because I know this is a nightmare for newer players especially, but hopefully after this video, these decks will be much less intimidating. This is a massive topic, so I separated it into two videos. This one will give you some generic strategies you need to know when facing Rush, but there will also be a part 2 where I'll talk about specific Rush decks you may run into. Keep in mind also that there's a lot of exceptions to every rule in Faeria. What I'm going to be talking about is what's best for most cases, but not all. The rest can only ever be learnt through experience. Rush isn't too difficult to beat right now if you know what you're doing, but it is very unforgiving if you make any mistakes, and this is the main reason new players struggle so much standing up to it. Their game plan has one major flaw, in that it is sacrificing Faeria collections in order to get to your face faster. So it's important to take advantage of this weakness by collecting from the wells yourself as much as possible. If you're not collecting, you're just enabling your opponent to carry out their game plan without any downsides. One of the easiest ways to help with that is simply by setting up your lands correctly. Proper land placement is crucial for many reasons when countering Rush. You have to be extremely efficient with all the resources at your disposal, and lands are the most controllable resource you have. So I'm going to go over a few different land formations you can use. The easiest and usually best setup is by building to each side of your orb. These 4 lands are known as defensive lands, because they're the quickest way to access 2 Faeria wells at once, and they're all within face range, so your creatures can defend you easier. Prioritize putting your best special land on the well spot, so if the majority of creatures in your deck are green, put your forests on the wells. And after you build these 4 lands, you'll want to make an even more defensive setup by building these 2 lands on C2 and E2, assuming those spots are still open. Sometimes you can take these lands first to try and cut off your opponent early, especially if you're playing yellow flyers, which don't need lands to step on, but this is a little bit more advanced, and if you're a new player, I'd recommend sticking to the sidelines first. The reason for building these lands is that you want to try and control your opponent's lines of attack, ideally channeling them down the center. These lands are great for the Rush player to have because if a creature is summoned on one of them, they can attack your orb at 2 possible angles, and even have a third option to collect from the Faeria well. A good Rush player will usually prioritize building these lands for those reasons, and this leaves the center space on D1 open. In most cases, you want to avoid building this center land if you have the option. If you can force your opponent to invest an extra turn building this center land, it prevents them from +1ing or drawing from the power wheel that turn. If you build the center land early on, you're also just putting your orb one step closer to your opponent. They're already struggling to reach you quickly by double neutraling. Don't make their life easier by building free lands to step on. Because these angled lands are so important to the Rush player, you can make a pretty accurate prediction of where they want to or should build their next land. If you can't entirely channel them down the center like I mentioned, you can at least try and channel them to where you want them. Here's a good example of where I channel my opponent off to the right side towards my sturdy grizzly, since I know my opponent will want to build on E2 and drop a creature there, unless they have dash or something. The grizzly has low mobility, but channeling my opponent's lands like this allows me to stay beside the Faeria well and feel reasonably safe that it'll still be in range of most things that they play. Sometimes you won't realize you're facing Rush until it's too late, and by this point you may have already invested the center land because you're playing jump creatures or something. So if this is the case, you still want to continue your lands towards one of the wells, but after that you can try going for a V defense if they're a little slower with their lands. Otherwise, you'll have to improvise a bit and decide if you want to defend your left side or push up even further on the right side. But we'll just talk about the V defense for right now. This is less effective than the side land start, but the V shape can still help you control your opponent's lands quite well. The structure of the V comes from only 3 lands, the center space on D1 and the 2 angled lands at C2 and E2. Even though you're building one of the well spots first, on either B2 or F2, you don't necessarily have to complete the entire V. Your next land placements will depend on your deck, your hand, and just how the match is playing out. With this setup, you're aiming to stop your opponent's creatures from stepping on your lands to prevent them from building their own lands on any of the 4 spaces to the sides of your orb. Having said this, you usually want to avoid building these 4 lands yourself and use your creatures to body block instead if you can. There's a few reasons for this. One is that it's much too difficult to fill in all 4 lands yourself, especially if you have a high special land requirement. And you could suggest to, instead of building the ends of the V on B2 or F2, to put those lands down 1 space on B1, F1, but the issue there is that you're giving up this really easy bridge into double collection, and a single creature double collecting for you can win you the rush matchup all by itself a lot of the time. You may need to transition into aggressive lands at some point too. If you can fend off everything your opponent plays using all the collections you're getting, that's great, you've pretty well won the match, but that won't always happen, and sometimes you'll need to apply pressure of your own to win the match. One last thing to point out is that the well spot on F2 is still great for the rush player to have. It may not be in face range, but the extra Faeria is more valuable a lot of the time, so it's really not a huge advantage for you to take the F1 spot instead anyways. Either well spot, though, is, as always, a top priority to defend with this defense, so if you can't block everything, at least try and channel your opponent's creatures down the center, just like in the last defense. This will force them to build lands right next to your orb instead of on the well spots. That may be mildly unintuitive for some newer players because, well, shouldn't I try to make them build lands as far from my orb as possible? Their game plan is to hit me in the face, right? But Faeria collections are way more valuable both for you and your opponent. The purpose of a rush deck is to apply a ton of early pressure, not necessarily hit you in the face. One modification you can make to the V defense is by building this land on D2 to create a diamond defense. This will only realistically work if your opponent is playing a really slow rush deck that doesn't build double neutrals, and you yourself will have to be playing flying creatures or something to make up for the fact that you're not building lands to the wells. Another rare case is if your hand is full of unplayable cards, then you may consider building a diamond to stall your opponent a bit until you draw into your creatures, or build enough special lands to play your hand. This defense will force your opponent to play their creature in the center tile and manually walk it to your orb, stopping any aggressive lands for at least 2 turns, assuming they don't have mobility at least. The last defense is not so much a defense, but a counter-rush strategy. This is pretty risky against traditional rush decks because your deck isn't designed to rush, whereas your opponent's deck is. But if you're confident enough with your opening hand, it is an option. You'll have a much easier time against slower, land-heavy rush decks, but if you're facing someone who's opened with double neutrals, I'd only ever attempt this going second with the Explore card, because you can claim the center land spot this way, slowing down your opponent's advance for a turn, which is really important when you're trying to race. You can also do this setup with an Elemental plus the Explorer. Usually you want a Water Ellie in this case though, since it can jump quickly to your opponent's orb. Out of all these defenses, the best one to use most of the time is going to be opening with the side lands. The other openings are slightly less defensive and require you to improvise a lot of the time, so if you're new to the game, I'd recommend just going for side lands until you're more comfortable with the rush matchup. Of course, if you're on ladder and can't predict whether they're rushing or not, and you've already invested the center land, then in that case, try for the V defense. Sometimes land placement will get a bit messy, and you can't always rely on perfect openings. So here are some other tips you should always keep in mind to help your chances of winning. Stepping on lands is a big one. Rush decks typically only want to build 2 special lands at your face, and then use their power wheel for drawing and +1ing to make up for their lack of collections. So if you can step on their lands, it'll force them to build extra lands, and they'll lose out on some much needed resources. They may even have to summon their creatures out of attacking range, and this can give you the extra breathing room you need to set up a permanent defense. You also want to try and keep access to both sides of your orb if you can. Rush will often try and close you off of one side, allowing them to set up safely beside one of the wells, and then you'll be struggling a lot to clear their creatures. Your goal in the Rush matchup is typically going to be to defend with all of your resources until you reach a certain point where you're either comfortable enough to move towards your opponent's orb, or have enough Faeria collectors and card draw to deal with any threat that they play. Oftentimes the Rush player will just surrender at this point, but some Rush decks you have to be careful with because they have indirect damage like Flame Burst or haste creatures or something. And in these cases, you definitely don't have the luxury of sitting back and answering everything they play. At some point, you'll have to build lands towards their orb and race them with your own creatures. Knowing when to transition from defending to attacking can be quite tricky to get the hang of, and it will take some practice. Just make sure you're thinking about what cards your opponent could possibly play on the next turn, and whether or not you can either answer those cards or beat their damage in a race. Obviously, this is tough to do if you've just picked up the game and you don't know all the popular cards yet, but this just comes with experience and observing what cards your opponent plays. Healing cards like Runan's Guidance can make a big difference in when you want to race also, and if you're facing Rush often, you may even want to consider adding healing to your deck anyways, because this can help you sustain yourself a little longer, but you still have to be strategic in how you play these cards. Don't be so quick to pull the trigger on your healing until you're absolutely sure that you have to use it. Runan's Guidance is 2 Faeria to heal yourself for 5, which is great, but it doesn't produce any creatures to collect or defend with, and the 5 life will only ever matter if you're about to die. If you hold on until it's absolutely necessary, you can spend that 2 Faeria to set up a much better defense. Faeria management, as I've mentioned a few times already, is really important and delicate in the Rush matchup. If you have a deck with a really high land requirement, you may even want to consider building only 3 or 4 lands and then +1ing or drawing with your power wheel, ignoring any of your high land cards. This can give you some painful draws sometimes, but it is worth considering if you have a starting hand that can support it. You also really have to be on top of well collections whenever possible, but at the same time, you have to know when to leave the wells to defend yourself. Most newer players, from what I've seen, usually put too much emphasis on defending and clearing creatures, and not enough emphasis on well collections. Losing 1 Faeria here or there may not seem like much, but it can really add up and hurt you later on in the match. And I know it's scary taking a hit to the face, but you have to treat your life total as just another resource to use. You don't lose the game until that number hits 0, so as long as you plan ahead and make sure you're setting up answers to anything that will drop that down to 0, prioritize the collections. On the flip side of things, you don't want to keep your creatures out of position for too long. Be aware of the mobility that your creatures have and how long it will take for them to step into trade range of things. This match is a great example of what I mean. I have the option here to clear the 7/6 Golem by using Humbling Vision, Falcon Dive, and my Frog, but this would leave me with no defenders, and I'm giving up Well Collection for the turn and the following turn, assuming the Frog survives. Maybe he can even double collect next turn, giving me 3 extra Faeria overall. I'm at a healthy 18 life here, so I don't mind at all taking 7 if it means I get to set up a much more solid defense with the Colossus in range of both of his mountains. The one risk to this setup is that I decided this match to give my opponent control over the left side with his lands. So he has the option here to build another mountain next to the well on B1 and play something like Axe Grinder. My Colossus will be out of range, so I'll either have to take another 5 to my face on top of the 7 from Golem, or use 3 Faeria on a Humbling Vision to reduce that next turn. So when making this play, I'm going to have to consider that and make sure I'm comfortable with whatever he could possibly play next. I also have to look at my hand and ask myself how I'm going to beat my opponent in the long run. Going down to 11 life is fine for now, but I'm going to have to apply my own pressure pretty quick, or else I'm just going to lose to all the burn damage that I've seen him play in previous matches. And as you can see, I've got another very clunky Colossus in desperate need of discounts with no other creatures to be seen. So this is my hopeful win condition to this match, where I might be able to drop the second Colossus at his face using the discounts that my Toad can give it, and challenge him to a race, while fending off as much stuff as I can with the extra Faeria I'm collecting and some of these humbling visions. And it ended up working out for me, winning the match with 4 life to spare. If you want to check out this full-length match or more sample matches where I defend against Rush, I've put some links down in the description below where I use all the various defenses that I talked about. And if you like this video, be sure to click through to part 2, where I'll be talking about how to beat specific Rush decks and some sample deck lists you can use to beat them. But that's all I have for today, so thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.